The auctioneer hadn't even finished reading the lot number when the laughter started. Not quiet snickering, not polite smiles hidden behind hands. Full, open, shoulders-shaking laughter. The kind that fills a courthouse hallway and bounces off marble floors and follows a woman all the way to her truck. Elena Harrow stood at the back of the room, her bidding paddle still raised, her jaw set so tight her back teeth ached. 55 acres of poison ivy, sumac, and wild vine so thick you couldn't see 20 feet into it. No road access. No water rights on record. Back taxes owed since 1987. The county couldn't give it away. They'd tried twice, and she'd just paid $121 for it. Her neighbor Dale Whitfield turned around in his seat, that slow grin spreading across his face the way it always did when he thought he'd caught someone making a mistake. "Elena," he said, loud enough for 2 rows to hear. "Honey, you just bought yourself a pile of itch." More laughter. She didn't answer him. She folded her paddle, tucked it under her arm, and walked out. But her hands were shaking. If you've ever made a decision that everyone told you was wrong, you already know what that walk to the truck feels like. This is her story. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now because the story you're about to hear is only going to get more extraordinary from here. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see just how far Elena's story has traveled. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, the same morning Elena found the 3rd dead chicken that week. She was standing in the dirt outside the coop, the bird hanging from her hand, still warm, when she heard the mail truck roll down the gravel lane and stop. She didn't move. She stood there with the dead chicken, looking at nothing in particular, thinking about the $340 she'd already spent on the veterinarian this month, and the $1,200 still due on the feed loan she'd taken out in March. The sun wasn't even fully up yet. The mountains to the west were still purple. The mailbox flag went up. The truck drove away. She laid the chicken carefully on the fence post. She'd bury it later, after coffee, after she figured out what had gotten into the coop, and walked to the mailbox. The envelope was from Consolidated Savings and Loan in Harlan. She knew what it was before she opened it. She'd been knowing for 3 months. Final notice of default. Amount past due, $4,847. If payment is not received in full within 30 days, foreclosure proceedings will commence on the following property. She read it twice, folded it back along its original creases, and walked to the kitchen. She put the kettle on. She sat down at the table. The same table Marcus had built from ponderosa pine their first winter together, sanded so many times over the years it was smooth as skin, and she put her face in her hands and she didn't cry. She was past crying. She was somewhere on the other side of crying, in that flat gray country where things just feel like facts. Marcus had been gone 14 months. He died the way strong men sometimes do, fast, without warning, without any of the slow preparation that might have given her time to learn the parts of the ranch he'd always handled. The cattle breeding records, the equipment maintenance schedule, the relationship with the bank manager who'd known Marcus since high school and had always been willing to talk. That bank manager had retired 6 weeks after Marcus's funeral. His replacement was a woman named Carla Briggs, 32 years old, sharp as a tack, absolutely not interested in sentiment or history. The loan was the loan. The number was the number. Elena understood. She didn't hold it against Carla Briggs. She just didn't have the money. The ranch was 412 acres in a wide river valley in southeastern Colorado, or it had been, until she'd sold the east pasture to pay off Marcus's medical bills, and then the strip along the highway to cover the estate taxes, and then the 2 parcels on the North Ridge to make it through last winter. What remained was 160 acres, the house, the barn, the outbuildings, and a cattle operation that had been steadily shrinking since the day she started managing it alone. She had 32 cows. She'd had 91 18 months ago. She understood, in the abstract, that she was losing. She understood it the way you understand weather, intellectually, completely, without quite believing it applies to you too. The county foreclosure auction notice came 3 weeks later, taped to the community board outside the hardware store in Mill Haven. She almost missed it. She'd driven to town for a box of staples and some baling wire, and she was walking back to her truck when the yellow paper caught her eye. She stood on the sidewalk and read the whole list. 23 properties. Mostly small parcels, backlots, the kind of land nobody wanted and nobody paid taxes on until the county got tired of waiting. Item 17 stopped her. Lot 17, 55.4 acres, Section 9, Township 23S, Range 67W. Unimproved. No road access of record. Back taxes due, $1,084 Austrian dollars. Minimum bid, $100. She knew that parcel. Everybody in the valley knew that parcel, the way you know a scar. By sight, not by touch. It occupied the whole western slope of the ridge above Garrison Creek, a solid green mass of vegetation so dense and aggressive that the county road crews had given up trying to clear the fence line along its edge back in 1994. The problem wasn't just the overgrowth. The problem was what the overgrowth was made of. Poison ivy and Virginia creeper and wild sumac stacked 3 and 4 and sometimes 6 feet high, with a canopy of volunteer cedar and choke cherry overhead, the whole mess sealed together like a wall. People said there was an old cabin somewhere in there, but nobody had seen it in living memory. People said a lot of things about that parcel. Mainly they said, nobody's ever going to do anything with that. Elena took a photograph of the notice with her phone and drove home. She spent 2 evenings researching. Not on the internet. Her satellite connection was too slow and unreliable for research, and she'd learned to distrust information that came too easy anyway. She drove to the county library in Harlan on Thursday morning and asked the librarian, a woman named Patricia Ogle, who'd been working there since 1979, if she could look at the historical land records for Section 9. Patricia looked at her over her reading glasses. The Garrison Creek section? Yes. You buying that parcel? I'm thinking about it. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, come on back, and led her to the records room. What Elena found spread across 3 hours of squinting at microfilm and handwritten ledgers was interesting. The parcel had been homesteaded in 1887 by a family named Garvey. It had passed through 3 other families before the last recorded owner, a man named Howard Pell, had simply stopped paying taxes on it in 1987 and apparently walked away. Nobody had purchased it since. Nobody had touched it. But the original Homestead survey, filed 1889, drawn in faded brown ink, showed something she hadn't expected. There was a creek, not Garrison Creek itself, which ran along the bottom of the valley, but a tributary, unnamed on all subsequent maps, that cut through the upper third of the parcel. Spring-fed, the original surveyor had noted in his cramped handwriting. Reliable. Does not dry in drought year. She sat back in her chair. A reliable spring. In southeastern Colorado, in a valley that had been watching its water table drop for 15 years, a reliable spring was not nothing. A reliable spring was not nothing at all. She went to the auction with $121 in her checking account and no plan beyond that number. The courthouse was fuller than she'd expected. County foreclosure auctions usually drew a small crowd. The same dozen or so land speculators who attended every sale, plus the occasional curious neighbor. But this one had drawn maybe 60 people, because item 3 on the list was the old Beaumont Mill property on the river, and 3 different development groups were competing for it. The energy in the room was the charged, competitive energy of money in motion. Elena knew most of the faces. She'd grown up in this valley, married into it, buried her husband in it. She nodded to people. Some nodded back. Some looked away. Dale Whitfield was there, Dale, who ran 600 head on the prime bottomland west of town. Dale, who had told Marcus once, at a 4th of July barbecue, that a woman couldn't run a cattle operation alone, and had said it cheerfully, as a simple statement of fact, the way you'd say it always rains in April. Marcus had laughed it off. Elena had not forgotten. Dale's son Travis was with him, 26 years old and already wearing his father's expression, that permanent mild amusement at the way the world arranged itself to confirm what he already believed. The auction moved quickly. The Beaumont Mill property sold for $340,000 after a spirited back and forth that had the room buzzing. Several smaller parcels went for modest amounts. Then the auctioneer reached item 17. He read the description in the flat, practiced monotone of a man who'd been doing this for 30 years. 55.4 acres. No road access. Back taxes due. Minimum bid $100. He looked up at the room. Do I have $100? Silence. Someone laughed, very quietly. This is the Garrison Creek poison ivy parcel, for those who aren't familiar, the auctioneer said with the tiniest smile. Any interest at $100? Elena raised her paddle. The auctioneer blinked. I have 100. Do I have 110? Silence. 110? No? He looked around the room. Going once at $100? 110. A man's voice from the left side of the room. Elena turned. She didn't recognize him. He was maybe 50, wearing a good jacket that looked wrong in this room, like a thing out of its natural habitat. 110. Thank you. Do I have 120? Elena raised her paddle. 121. The room went very quiet, the way rooms do when something slightly unexpected happens. The man in the good jacket looked at her. Something crossed his face. Not amusement, not contempt, something harder to name, like recalculation. And then he looked away and sat back in his chair. 121, the auctioneer said. Do I have 130? He waited. Going once. Going twice. The gavel came down. Sold. $121. And that was when Dale Whitfield turned around. Elena, he said, loud and comfortable, completely at ease with himself. Honey, you just bought yourself a pile of itch. The laughter moved through the room like a wave. Not everyone laughed, maybe a third of the room. But it was enough. It was the particular kind of laughter that is really a verdict. The sound of people confirming something they'd already decided about you. Elena folded her paddle. She tucked it under her arm. She walked to the clerk's table, wrote a check for $121, and signed the transfer paperwork. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the table while she signed so nobody could see. She drove home with the deed on the passenger seat. Halfway there, she pulled off the road onto a dirt track that led to a stock pond Marcus had dug in 1998. She turned the engine off. She sat for a long time looking at the water, which was lower than it should have been for this time of year. Everything was lower than it should be. The water table, her bank account, her confidence in her own judgment. She picked up the deed, 55.4 acres. She thought about the man in the good jacket. She didn't know who he was, but she knew the jacket, the quality of it, the way it sat on someone who was used to wearing things that cost money. She knew what that meant in a room full of ranchers and farmers and county commissioners at a foreclosure auction. It meant someone was there for a reason that wasn't obvious. He'd bid. He'd bid without enthusiasm, the way you test something, the way you set a line to see if anything bites. And when she'd outbid him by $1, one single dollar, he'd let it go. Too easily. That bothered her. A man in a jacket like that didn't drive out to a county auction and let 55 acres of anything go for a single dollar, unless he thought he could get it another way. She put the truck in gear and drove home. The goat idea came to her from an unexpected source. 3 weeks after the auction, she was at a small livestock sale in Harlan, looking, not buying, she couldn't afford to buy, when she fell into conversation with a woman named June Patel, who ran a small operation outside of town. June was maybe 65, compact and direct, with the kind of unhurried confidence that comes from having survived enough bad years to stop being surprised by them. They were leaning on a fence watching a pen of boar crosses go through the ring, and Elena mentioned the parcel, mostly just to have something to say. She described the vegetation, the poison ivy, the sumac, the impenetrable wall of it. June looked at her. Nigerian dwarfs, she said. What? Or boar crosses. Goats. June nodded at the pen. They'll eat that stuff down to the ground. Poison ivy doesn't bother goats. Neither does sumac. You throw enough goats at a hillside like that, they'll strip it clean in a season. Maybe 2. Elena stared at her. You're serious? Goat brush clearing's been a thing for 20 years. People rent herds out for it. June shrugged. Problem is, you need enough animals to make a dent and enough time to let them work. And you need to keep them penned tight so they move through systematic and don't just scatter. Elena was quiet for a moment. How many goats are we talking about? For 55 acres of heavy overgrowth? June thought about it. 60. 80 might be better, and you'd want to keep them on rotating sections so they're always hitting new growth. Elena did the math in her head. It didn't work with the money she had. But it worked with the money she might be able to put together if she sold the last 4 heifers she'd been planning to keep for breeding, and if she took the small equipment loan she'd been avoiding, and if nothing went wrong for the next 8 months, which was a lot of ifs. Where would I find 60 goats? She asked. June smiled, a small private smile that suggested she'd already known where this conversation was going before it started. I might know a few people, she said. What? She bought 37 goats over the following 6 weeks. Not 60. 37, because that was what she could afford, and because she'd decided that doing something imperfectly was better than doing nothing while she waited for perfect conditions that were never going to arrive. 22 were boar crosses, big, aggressive browsers that could eat through anything. 15 were a mixed hodgepodge she'd assembled from 3 different small farms, part Spanish, part Kiko. One animal of entirely uncertain ancestry that June referred to diplomatically as motivated. She named that one Franklin because he reminded her of a person she'd known in high school who'd been notoriously difficult to discourage. She fenced the parcel, or rather, she fenced the accessible perimeter of it, which took 11 days of labor she mostly performed alone, with 2 afternoons of help from Patricia Ogle's teenage grandson, who showed up unannounced with a post-pounder and didn't ask to be paid, which was the kind of thing that still existed in this valley if you knew where to look. She built temporary water access from a tank she trucked in twice a week. She sectioned the interior of the parcel into rough paddocks, using portable electronet, moving the goats every 5 to 7 days onto fresh ground. And then she waited to see if it would work. Well, the first thing she noticed was the noise. Goats are not quiet animals. They have opinions, and they express them constantly, in tones ranging from mild complaint to existential outrage. The hillside, which had been silent for decades, sealed under its green vault, thick and muffled, began to sound, for the first time in living memory, inhabited. She drove out every morning before her other chores to check them. She learned their rhythms and their personalities faster than she'd expected. Franklin consistently found holes in the electronet that shouldn't have been possible given the laws of physics. An older boar cross she'd named Margaret was the undisputed authority of the herd and enforced a social order Elena came to respect for its efficiency. There were 3 young wethers who operated as a unit and were collectively responsible for approximately 40% of all problems. The work was not glamorous. She pulled a goat from a tangle of old fencing wire at 7:30 on a Sunday morning in October, in a cold rain, cutting her palm on the wire, kneeling in mud. She lost a young doe in November, 'cause unclear, probably respiratory, the veterinarian said. These things happen, and stood at the edge of the parcel in the thin winter light, and felt the specific hollow grief of livestock loss, which is not the same as any other kind of grief, but is still grief, still the absence of something that was alive and is now not. She didn't tell anyone about the loss. She didn't have anyone she particularly told things to anymore. She adjusted the herd's rotation. She kept going. It was in December, 4 months after the auction, that she first began to see what was underneath. The goats had worked through the lower third of the parcel by then, and what they left behind was not the barren scrubland she'd half expected. The soil beneath the stripped vegetation was dark and dense, rich with decades of accumulated organic matter from the leaf fall of all that growth. Freed of the competition, native grasses were already pushing up through it, thin, tentative, but undeniably there. And the structure of the land itself, now visible for the first time, was different from what she'd imagined. There were terraces. Human-made terraces, cut into the hillside in a pattern that was not natural, not random. The kind of terracing a farmer does to work steep ground, to hold soil and water on a slope that would otherwise wash out. The terraces were old, very old, by the look of the stonework that edged them, fitted without mortar, in the way that meant hands, not machines. She stood on the hillside for a long time, looking at the terraces. Someone had worked this land. Someone had lived here, and worked this land carefully, and built things that lasted. She walked the exposed section from one end to the other, moving slowly, looking at the ground. Near the upper edge of the cleared area, where the goats hadn't reached yet, where the vine curtain still hung dense and impenetrable, something caught her eye. A shape that wasn't a tree, a vertical line that was too straight to be natural. She pushed through the last fringe of cleared brush to get closer. It was a chimney, hand-laid stone, maybe 12 feet high where it still stood, broken at the top where freeze-thaw had worked on it over the decades. She put her hand on it. The stone was cold and very solid and absolutely real. "Well," she said to nobody. Her voice disappeared into the hillside. She stood there with her hand on the chimney of someone's house, someone's life, buried for 60 years under a wall of poison, and she thought, "I bought this. This is mine." And then, because she was Elena Harrow and not a person given to sentiment when there was work to be done, she thought, "I need to know exactly what else is under there." She walked back to her truck. She had morning chores that couldn't wait. She had a herd that needed water, and a fence on the east side that needed checking, and $4,847 still owed to Consolidated Savings and Loan, and 30 days before Carla Briggs filed the paperwork. But for the first time in 14 months, she drove home with something unfamiliar sitting in her chest. It felt, cautiously and without permission, like anticipation. She went back the next morning with a flashlight, a pair of leather gloves, and no particular plan beyond getting a better look. The chimney was still there, which was the kind of thought you have when something feels unreal enough that you need to confirm it hasn't changed overnight. She stood at the edge of the cleared ground in the early gray light and looked at it, the way it rose out of the remaining vine tangle like something surfacing, and she felt again that odd doubling sensation, the sense of something very old pressing up against the present. She put her gloves on and pushed into the growth. The goats hadn't reached this section yet. She was working through the second paddock rotation, and the upper slope was still scheduled for late January. The brush here was thick and the vines were everywhere, and she moved slowly, snapping branches, ducking under cedar limbs, pulling herself forward by feel as much as sight. The flashlight was useless in the daylight, but she'd brought it for the interior, if there was an interior. There was. What the goats would eventually reveal in full, she was getting her first glimpse of now, the front wall of a cabin, or what had been a cabin's front wall, still standing to maybe 8 feet on the left side and collapsed to rubble on the right. The chimney rose from what had been the interior. The floor, where she could see it through the vine mat, was flat stone, the same fitted without mortar technique as the terracing. 2 window openings, no glass, no frames, just square holes in the stone that the wilderness had been trying to swallow for 60 years. She stood in what had been the doorway. She knew it was the doorway because the threshold stone was still there, worn smooth in the middle in the way thresholds wear when enough feet have crossed them. And she looked in. Something moved in the back corner. She startled badly, one hand going to the wall, and then identified it as a pack rat, who was considerably less frightened of her than she was of it. She let out a long breath. "Fair enough," she said. She spent 40 minutes in there, moving carefully, not touching anything she didn't have to touch. The cabin had been maybe 18 by 20 feet. There was evidence of a loft. The stub ends of hand-hewn joists still protruded from the upper portion of the standing wall. There were iron hardware remnants, hinges and a hook, the kind of hand-forged metalwork that stopped being made around 1910. There was a wooden object in the far corner, partially collapsed under its own weight, that might have been a chair or might have been a small table. She couldn't tell and didn't want to disturb it until she understood better what she was dealing with. What she understood, standing in that roofless cabin in the January cold, was that this was old. Not old like her house, which had been built in 1932. Old like before electricity, before the county road. Old like the valley's original story, whatever that was. She drove to the library that afternoon. What? Patricia Ogle recognized her footstep now, which was either a good sign or a sign that Elena had been spending too much time in the records room, and she wasn't entirely sure which. The librarian looked up from her desk when Elena came in, took in her expression, and said simply, "Found something?" "A cabin," Elena said. "Stone, hand-hewn joists, iron hardware. I need the original Homestead records for that parcel again, but I also need, I don't know, whatever you have on early settlement in this valley, before 1900. Patricia took her glasses off. She looked at Elena the way she looked at research problems. Not excited exactly, but engaged, the particular focus of someone who genuinely loves finding things. "Sit down," she said. "This might take a while." It took 3.5 hours. What they assembled, pulling from the Homestead records and the county history books that Patricia had been quietly collecting for 30 years, and 2 hand-typed indexes that a local historian named Walter Briggs, no relation to Carla, had compiled in the 1970s before his death, was this. The Garvey family, who'd originally filed the Homestead claim in 1887, had not been the first people on that land. The original settler was a man named James Aldercott, who'd arrived in the valley in 1861, 26 years before the formal homestead filing, in the years before this part of Colorado was organized enough for official claims. He'd built a cabin and worked the land on squatters' rights, and by the time the Homestead Act reached this county, he'd been on that hillside long enough that his claim was grandfathered without contest. James Aldercott had died in 1879. His wife, a woman named Ruth, had died in 1882. They had 4 children, 3 of whom had left the valley before 1887, when the Garvey family purchased the improved land. Walter Briggs's index had a single line about Aldercott that stopped Elena cold. Aldercott James, credited locally as first permanent settler in the upper Garrison Creek drainage. His cabin, constructed ca. 1861-1863, was the site of the valley's first winter gathering, 1864-65. Location now uncertain. She read the line 3 times. "Patricia," she said, and her voice came out strange. Patricia read the line. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Location now uncertain." She looked up. "Until now." "Until now," Elena said. They looked at each other across the table in the basement records room with its bad fluorescent lighting and its smell of old paper, and something passed between them. Not excitement exactly, not yet, because Elena was still too cautious for that, had been burned too recently by optimism, but recognition. The recognition of something that mattered. "There might be a cemetery," Patricia said. "Homesteaders buried on property. That was common." Elena hadn't thought of that. She thought of it now, and it settled something in her chest, something heavier than excitement. "I need to clear that hillside before anything else," she said. "I need to see what's up there." "Yes," Patricia said simply. "You do." January was brutal that year. The cold came in hard after the holidays and stayed, the kind of cold that gets into equipment and makes it fail, that splits water lines and freezes locks, and turns the simplest outdoor task into a negotiation with misery. Elena lost a water tank heater in the 3rd week of January and spent 2 days hauling water by hand until she could get a replacement shipped from Harlan. She found a section of goat fence down one morning after a wind event that must have hit 50 miles per hour overnight, and spent half a day in temperatures that didn't reach 10 degrees repairing it, working in gloves too thick for the fencing work, her hands clumsy and slow. Franklin escaped 4 times in January. She stopped being angry about it and started treating it as a given, the same way you learn to treat certain kinds of weather. But the goats worked. Even in winter they worked, stripping bark from the cedars, eating down the dried vine stems, pawing through the snow to reach the brush underneath. The hillside was transforming, slowly, in the way that real transformations happen. Not dramatically, not in moments, but incrementally, daily, in ways you only noticed when you compared now to 3 months ago. By February, 60% of the lower parcel was cleared. The terracing was fully visible now, running in long parallel curves across the slope, and she'd found 2 more structural remnants. A stone foundation she thought might be a root cellar, and a section of dry stack wall that had once enclosed what she guessed was a kitchen garden, based on the soil color inside it, darker and richer than the surrounding ground. She photographed everything. She'd started keeping a notebook, which was not a thing she'd ever been given to. Marcus had been the record keeper, the methodical one. But something about this place demanded documentation. She wrote down dates and locations and dimensions in her cramped, unpracticed handwriting, and when she looked back at the early entries, she could see the difference in her own prose, the way it had shifted from clipped and uncertain to something more assured, the writing of a person who'd started to trust what they were finding. She was out on the hillside on a Wednesday afternoon in late February, photographing the root cellar entrance, when she heard a car on the road below. Not unusual. The county road ran along the valley floor maybe a quarter mile from the parcel boundary, and there was regular traffic. But this car slowed. It stopped. She heard a door, and then footsteps on gravel, and then silence. She didn't think much of it. She went back to her photographing. It was only that evening, driving home, that she noticed the tire tracks on the dirt pull-off near the parcel gate, tracks from a vehicle with wide tires, heavier than a ranch truck. She stopped and looked at them in her headlights. They'd pulled off, idled for a while based on the depth of the impression, and then pulled back out. She drove home and didn't sleep particularly well. Oh, the letter came on a Friday in early March. It was on good paper, cream-colored, heavy stock, with a logo at the top she didn't immediately recognize. Meridian Resource Group, LLC, Denver, Colorado. The letter was brief, 3 paragraphs, very politely worded in the way that expensive lawyers write letters when they want something and haven't yet decided how hard to push. The company, the letter explained, was engaged in regional resource assessment and had identified her recently acquired parcel as potentially adjacent to their area of interest. They would be grateful for the opportunity to discuss a possible purchase at her earliest convenience. A number was provided, an offer, though the letter was careful not to call it that, of $40,000 for 55 acres of poison ivy that she'd bought for $121. She set the letter down on Marcus's table and looked at it for a long time. $40,000 would pay off the loan default and put something back in the bank and buy her maybe 2 years of breathing room. 2 years in which she might be able to rebuild the cattle operation to the point where it supported itself. She thought about that number. She thought about what it would feel like to write that check to Carla Briggs at Consolidated Savings and Loan and close that file and not have that weight on her chest every morning when she woke up. Then she thought about the threshold stone, worn smooth in the middle. She folded the letter and put it in her desk drawer. Oh, she told June about it 2 days later, standing outside June's barn, while June sorted a pen of kids into weaning groups with the efficient, unhurried competence of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. Meridian Resource Group, June said, without looking up. You know them? I know of them. June separated a doe kid from a buck with one smooth movement. They were sniffing around the Hendricks place 2 years ago, the old grazing lease on the South Ridge. Nothing came of it publicly, but Hendricks told me they were very interested in the subsurface rights. Elena felt something cold move through her. Subsurface. Mineral rights. Coal, most likely. There's an old seam that runs through this part of the county, been known about since the 30s, never developed because the market wasn't there. Or that was the story. June looked at her then, direct and calm. That parcel of yours sit on the ridge? Upper slope, yeah. June went back to sorting. I wouldn't sell. I wasn't planning to. Good. She paused. They're going to come back with a bigger number. I figured. And when that doesn't work, they're going to try something else. That's how these outfits operate. She moved another kid. You got your deed recorded properly? All the back taxes cleared? First thing I did. Good, June said again. Stay boring on paper. Don't give them anything to work with. Elena drove home thinking about coal seams and subsurface rights and a man in a good jacket who'd bid to 110 and then let it go too easily. And the more she thought about it, the more certain she became that the man in the jacket had not, in fact, given up. She found the cemetery in March. She'd been working the goats through the upper paddock, the last section, the most impenetrable, where the vine growth was oldest and thickest, when Margaret, the lead doe, stopped moving and stood with her head up in a way Elena had come to recognize as the animal detecting something that wasn't right. The other goats bunched up behind her. Franklin, characteristically, ignored the social signal and pushed to the front. Elena walked up to see what they were stopped at. It was a fence. Not her fence, an old fence, iron rod and hand-twisted wire, barely standing, mostly consumed by the vines that had grown through and over it. But a fence deliberately placed in a rectangle maybe 30 by 40 feet, enclosing a level section of ground that the vine growth had left oddly clear at its interior, as if even the poison ivy had some respect for what was underneath. She pushed the gate. It had been a gate once, the hinges were still there, and stepped inside. 7 stones. Hand-carved, the lettering worn but legible on most of them. She got down on her knees in the cold ground and read them one by one. James Aldercott, 1821, 1879. He came west and stayed. Ruth Mary Aldercott, 1828, 1882. She made it home, 5 smaller stones. 2 infants, unnamed, dated 1864 and 1869. 3 children, named, ranging from ages 2 to 11, all died in the same year, 1878. She didn't know what had happened in 1878 and didn't let herself imagine it. She sat back on her heels and looked at the 7 stones for a long time. The goats grazed around the fence perimeter, incurious, efficient. James Aldercott, 1821. He'd been born the same year that Colorado wasn't yet Colorado, when this whole country was still called something else on maps that mostly guessed at the geography. He'd come here in 1861 during the war, and he'd built a cabin on a hillside and made terraces and cultivated a kitchen garden and buried 5 of his children in 1 year and kept going. And now he'd been under a wall of poison ivy for 60 years with a handmade fence around him, and nobody had known where he was. "I found you," she said, which was a strange thing to say to a gravestone, and she knew it. But there was nobody around to hear, and it seemed like the right thing to say. She took photographs of every stone. She measured the enclosure. She recorded everything in her notebook with her cramped handwriting. Then she called Patricia Ogle from the edge of the parcel, standing in the cold with the wind coming down off the ridge. Patricia answered on the second ring. "I found the cemetery," Elena said. There was silence on the line. Then Patricia said very quietly, "Oh my." 7 graves, James and Ruth Aldercott and 5 children, all the original family. The stones are hand-carved and most of the lettering is still readable. Another silence. "Elena," Patricia's voice was careful, "this changes things." "I know. Historic burial site on private property. That triggers preservation considerations. You'd need to contact the County Historical Society, possibly the state office. And if there's a resource company trying to acquire that land—" "I know," Elena said again. "I need to move fast." "Yes," Patricia said. "You do." She went to the County Historical Society the following Monday. The Millhaven County Historical Society operated out of a Victorian house on the east end of Main Street that smelled permanently of old wood and linseed oil and the particular mustiness of things that had been kept for a long time. The director was a man named Howard Gast, 68 years old, who wore the same brown cardigan apparently every day of his professional life, and had the quality, rare and genuine, of being genuinely excited about history in a way that had never thinned out with age. He listened to everything Elena told him. He looked at every photograph on her phone. He read the notes from Walter Briggs's index that she'd photocopied. And then he sat back in his chair and said, "The first permanent settler in the Upper Garrison Creek drainage, built 1861. That's what Briggs's index says. That would make it the oldest surviving structure in the county." He looked at her. "Possibly in the region." "I figured. And there's a complete family cemetery. 7 stones, all legible or partially legible." He picked up a pen and set it back down. "Mrs. Harrow, do you understand what you have up there?" "I'm starting to," she said. "There are people, scholars, historians, preservation groups, who have been trying to locate the Aldercott homestead for 40 years. Walter Briggs spent the last decade of his life looking for it. He died without finding it." He paused. "And your goats found it." "My goats found it," she agreed. He almost smiled. "We need to get a preservation specialist out there. We need photographs that meet documentation standards. We need to contact the State Historical Fund before anyone else gets wind of this." He was reaching for his phone already. "And I need you to understand, once we file a formal documentation request, this site may qualify for state and potentially national historic designation. That would give it legal protection that would be very, very difficult to override." "That's what I want," Elena said. "That's exactly what I want." He looked at her. "There's a resource company inquiring about the property?" "Meridian Resource Group, out of Denver. They've sent 1 letter, a purchase offer." "How much?" $40,000. "For 55 acres. He was quiet a moment. "That's not a real offer. That's a first contact." "I know." "They'll go higher." "I know that too." Howard Gast put his phone down and looked at her in the particular way of a man reassessing a situation. "Mrs. Harrow," he said, "may I ask you something directly?" "Go ahead." "Why don't you just take the money, 40,000 or whatever they come up with next? You'd clear your problems with the bank. You could walk away from this whole business and be better off financially than you were before." Elena considered the question. She considered it genuinely, because it deserved a genuine answer, not the reflexive one. "Because the minute I sell," she said, "they strip out whatever they're after, and James Aldercott disappears again, permanently this time. And 160 years from now, nobody will know where this valley started." Howard Gast looked at her for a moment longer. Then he picked up his phone. Let me call the state office, he said. Oh. The second letter from Meridian Resource Group arrived in the third week of March, 12 days after her meeting with Howard Gast. It came by certified mail, which required a signature, which meant they knew she'd received it. The number had gone up. Not to 45,000. Not to 50. The number in the second letter was $280,000, and it landed on Marcus's table with a weight that was almost physical, because $280,000 was not breathing room. It was a different life. It was the cattle operation rebuilt, the equipment replaced, the mortgage paid off with money left over. It was financial stability of a kind she hadn't felt since Marcus was alive. She sat at the table for a long time. The letter was signed by someone named Gavin Mercer, Vice President of Land Acquisition, Meridian Resource Group. The language was still polite, still carefully nonspecific about what exactly made her parcel worth $280,000 more than the county had valued it at. But the jump from $40,000 to $280,000 was not the move of a company negotiating. It was the move of a company that had just realized it was running out of time. She'd learned something from watching livestock all her adult life. When an animal changes speed suddenly, something has changed in its environment. The question was what? She called Howard Gast. The State Preservation Office filed the preliminary documentation request yesterday, he told her. It was a public filing. Anyone tracking county property records would have seen it. So they know the site has been found. They know a formal preservation process has been started. Yes. He paused. Mrs. Harrow, I want to be honest with you. A preliminary filing is not a designation. It starts a process that could take months. During that time, you still own the property. They can still try to buy it. And if they buy it before the designation is complete, a new owner could conceivably argue that the preservation process should restart. It's complicated. The legal picture is not... He stopped. It's not as certain as I'd like it to be. She looked at the letter. $280,000. Then we need to move faster, she said. I'm working on that, Howard said. I have a call in to a woman at the university, an architectural historian named Dr. Summers, who specializes in early Colorado settlement. If she comes out and confirms the significance of the site, it accelerates the process considerably. How soon can she come? I'm hoping within 2 weeks. 2 weeks. She thought about the man in the good jacket at the auction who'd let it go too easily, and the car that had idled on the road below the parcel, and now $280,000 arriving by certified mail the day after a public filing. Howard, she said, how much coal is under this hill? There was a pause on the line. I don't know, he said carefully. That would require a geological assessment. But you have a guess. Another pause. The Garrison seam runs roughly north-south through this part of the county. If that parcel sits over the main seam, and based on the topography, it might, then the reserves could be substantial. He was quiet for a moment. Substantial enough that $280,000 would be a very small fraction of what they'd extract. She put the letter face down on the table. I'm not selling, she said. She heard him let out a breath he'd probably been holding. Good, he said. Then let's get Dr. Summers out there as fast as we can. Dr. Summers arrived on a Thursday, 2.5 weeks later, driving a mud-spattered university sedan that she parked at an angle that suggested she'd given up on straight lines sometime in graduate school. She was 51, compact and brisk, with short gray hair and the focused, slightly distracted energy of someone whose mind was usually about 4 steps ahead of her body. She shook Elena's hand, looked up at the hillside. The goats were visible on the upper slope, still working, Franklin leading the charge as usual, and said, Tell me everything. Start from when you bought it. Elena told her everything. They walked the parcel while she talked, Dr. Summers stopping constantly to crouch down and look at things, to take her own photographs, to measure wall sections with a tape and mutter numbers into a small recorder she kept in her breast pocket. At the cemetery, she was very still for a very long time. James Aldercott, she said, not loudly. 1821 to 1879. You know the name? He's in 3 different secondary sources on early Colorado settlement, always as a reference to someone else's story. Nobody knew where he'd actually settled. She crouched and looked at the lettering on his stone. He kept a journal. Did you know that? Elena stared at her. What? A journal. It passed through several hands. It's in a private collection now, in Denver. A collector named... It doesn't matter, I know the collector. The journal describes this valley in the 1860s. His cabin, his land, his neighbors. She stood up slowly, brushing dirt from her knees. Scholars have been using it as a primary source for 40 years without knowing where he actually lived. Elena felt the hillside tilt slightly under her feet, the way ground does when something shifts. So the journal describes this place, she said, in detail. Dr. Summers looked at her. Mrs. Harrow, this is not just a historic site. This is a site that is already documented in primary source material, which means the evidentiary case for designation is extraordinarily strong. She paused. I can have a full assessment report ready in 3 weeks, and I'm going to contact the National Register office directly, not just the state. How long does National Register designation take? Normally months, sometimes longer. She looked at Elena steadily. But I know people, and when I call them about this, they'll understand why it needs to move faster than normal. Elena nodded. She looked at James Aldercott's stone. He came west and stayed. She thought about what it meant to stay somewhere, what it cost, what it built. Do whatever you need to do, she said. I'm not going anywhere. Dr. Summers nodded once, businesslike, already reaching for her recorder. Neither is this hill, she said. The goats moved steadily above them, working the last section of the upper slope, stripping away the last of what had hidden this place for 60 years. The sound of them, that constant, opinionated noise, carried down the hillside in the cold spring air, and Elena stood in the cemetery with the 7 stones around her and listened to the sound of her ridiculous, expensive, absolutely essential goats eating the valley's history back into the light. The third letter from Meridian Resource Group did not come by mail. It came in person, which was a different kind of message entirely. Elena was in the barn on a Tuesday morning in early April, working through the herd's hooves, a job she hated and the goats hated more, a twice-yearly negotiation between her determination and their profound objection to having their feet handled, when she heard a vehicle come up the drive. Not a ranch truck. The sound was too smooth, too quiet, the kind of engine that had never pulled a trailer. She set down the hoof pick, wiped her hands on her jeans, and walked out. It was a black SUV, clean in the way that things are clean when someone else is responsible for keeping them that way. The man who got out of it was the same man she'd seen at the county auction, the one in the good jacket. Except now she had a name for him. From the letter he'd signed, Gavin Mercer, Vice President of Land Acquisition, Meridian Resource Group. He was perhaps 52, silver at the temples, with the kind of face that had been handsome when he was younger and had settled into something more calculating. He wore a different jacket from the one at the auction, but the same quality. He looked at the barn, at the goats visible on the hillside, at Elena's dirty jeans and the hoof pick she was still holding, and he arranged his expression into something friendly. "Mrs. Harrow," he said, "I hope I'm not interrupting." She didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at him the way you look at a gate latch that's been tampered with, checking for damage before you decide how to respond. "You could have called," she said. "I prefer to speak in person when possible." He smiled. It was a good smile. Practiced. "May I have a few minutes of your time?" She could have said no. She thought about saying no. But she wanted to see him, wanted to hear what he said and how he said it, wanted to know what Meridian Resource Group looked like when it came to your door, instead of sending polished letters on heavy paper. "Come in," she said, and led him to the kitchen. She didn't offer coffee. She sat across from him at Marcus's table and put her hands flat on the wood and waited. He opened with appreciation. That was his first move. A compliment on what she'd accomplished with the parcel, the clearing work, the goats, which he'd clearly researched because he used specific numbers. He called it remarkable and entrepreneurial, and she could see him deciding in real time which version of her he was dealing with, the cash-strapped widow who'd gotten lucky, or something more complicated. "I'll be direct," he said after the warm-up. "Our previous offer of $280,000 stands, but given the preservation activity that's been initiated on the property, and we're aware of Dr. Summers's involvement, we'd like to resolve this quickly while resolution is still simple." He paused. "We're prepared to go to $400,000, Mrs. Harrow. Final offer." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, she could hear the goats. She could always hear the goats. "That's a lot of money," she said. "It is," he agreed. "What's under my hill, Mr. Mercer?" Something moved across his face, quick as a fish under water, and was gone. I'm sorry? The coal seam. The garrison seam. I'm told it's called locally. How much of it runs under my parcel, and what's it worth? The friendly expression didn't disappear exactly. He was too good for that. But it reset, recalibrated, settled into something slightly more careful. Our geological assessments are proprietary. Of course they are. She kept her hands flat on the table. So you won't tell me? What I can tell you is that our offer is substantially above market value for unimproved acreage in this. My acreage isn't unimproved anymore, she said, and it isn't unimportant anymore. And I think you know both of those things, which is why you drove out here yourself instead of sending another letter. He looked at her. The calculation was visible now. Not hostile, just real, the look of someone doing genuine arithmetic. The preservation process is preliminary, he said. It's not certain. No, she agreed, but it's moving. These processes can stall. They can be challenged. He said it neutrally, not as a threat, just as information being shared. Property owners who cooperate with resource development often find that the process is mutually beneficial. There are community benefit agreements, employment opportunities. Mr. Mercer. She said his name flatly, not rudely, just to stop the momentum of the pitch. James Aldercott built that cabin in 1861. His wife made curtains for the windows, and his children grew up on that hillside, and 5 of them died in 1 year, and he buried them up there and kept going. He was the first person to make a life in this part of the valley. She paused. I'm not selling the hill he's buried on so you can dig coal out from under him. That's where we are. The silence stretched out between them. Gavin Mercer picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He'd laid it over the chair when he sat, which now struck her as presumptuous, and stood. I understand, he said, in a tone that suggested he didn't quite, but was choosing not to argue about it yet. I hope you'll keep the offer in mind. I'll keep everything in mind, she said. She walked him to his car. She watched the black SUV turn around at the end of the drive and move back toward the county road, quiet and smooth. She stood in the yard for a moment after it disappeared, her hands in her jacket pockets. Then she went back to the barn and finished the hooves. She called Howard Gass that evening. He came to the house, she said. Howard was quiet for a moment. In person. In person. 400,000. He called it a final offer. It isn't. I know that. She was standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the dark. He said the preservation process could be challenged. He said it could stall. He's not wrong that it can be challenged, Howard said. But a formal challenge to a National Register nomination is expensive and public and tends to generate exactly the kind of attention that resource extraction companies prefer to avoid. He paused. That said, Dr. Summers's report isn't complete yet. Until it's filed, we're in a window where they have options. How much longer? She told me 10 days. I've been calling her every other day. Call her every day, Elena said. Elena? Every day, Howard. A pause. All right, he said. Every day. She hung up and stood at the window and thought about Gavin Mercer's face when she'd mentioned the coal seam, that quick movement beneath the surface, there and gone, and the way he'd said these processes can stall in the same neutral tone you'd use for weather. She'd been married to a rancher for 19 years. She understood what it meant when something that looked calm was working very hard underneath. The morning 6 days later any other. She was out at the parcel by 7, running the goat check, moving the last paddock section through their final rotation on the upper slope. The parcel was almost completely clear now. Maybe 5% of the original overgrowth remained, tucked into corners where the terrain made it hard for the goats to access, and she'd been planning to go in by hand to finish those sections. Standing at the upper fence line and looking out across what had been invisible 4 months ago, she could see the full shape of what James Aldercott had built. The cabin, the terraces, the kitchen garden enclosure, the root cellar, the cemetery. It had a coherence to it that moved her every time she looked at it. The logic of a life lived on this specific piece of ground, everything placed where it was for a reason that still made sense 160 years later. She was checking the water tank when she heard it. Not a car this time. A truck. A heavy one, diesel, coming up the county road from the south. Then a second one. She straightened and looked toward the road, and she saw the flatbed. It had equipment on it, something large under a tarp. Turn off the county road onto the dirt track that ran along the south boundary of her parcel boundary. Not onto her property, but right up to the edge of it. She walked to the south fence line. By the time she got there, 2 trucks and a smaller pickup had pulled up on the adjacent parcel, the BLM strip of land that ran between her property and the county road, and 3 men she didn't know were getting out. One of them had what looked like survey equipment. She stood at her fence line and looked at them. One of them looked back. "Morning," he said, pleasantly enough. "What are you doing?" she said. "Survey work." He smiled. "Nothing that concerns your property, ma'am." She looked at the equipment on the flatbed. She looked at the survey poles. She looked at the 3 men who were already beginning to set up, moving with the efficiency of people who had done this many times and were not interested in having conversations about it. "Survey for what purpose?" she said. "You'd have to talk to the contracting company about that." She got their company name off the side of the truck. Peakline Survey and Assessment, Grand Junction. She photographed the truck, the equipment, the men, and the GPS unit one of them was already running. Then she called Howard Gast, standing at her fence line with the wind in her face. "They're surveying the BLM strip adjacent to my south boundary," she said, "from the county road to the corner of my parcel." She could hear Howard thinking on the other end of the line. "That strip is approximately 40 feet wide," he said. "It runs between your parcel and the road." "Right. Elena." His voice was careful. "If they establish a legal access route across the BLM strip to the southern edge of your parcel, and then apply for a forced access easement, they could run equipment in without my permission. It's a long shot. The legal standard for forced access on historically significant land is very high, but it's a move they could make." He paused. "It's also a pressure move. They want you to know they're still working the problem." She looked at the surveyors. One of them was writing something on a clipboard with the comfortable focus of someone doing routine work, not someone who thought he was doing anything wrong. Which was the thing about this. Nobody in that truck had done anything wrong. They were just surveyors. They'd been hired to do a job, and they were doing it. The wrongness was somewhere else, somewhere above their pay grade and above the county road, and probably in an office in Denver with a nice view. "I need Dr. Summers's report filed," she said. "I'm calling her now," Howard said. The report was filed 9 days later. Elena didn't know what Howard said to Dr. Summers, and didn't ask. She suspected it was a version of what she'd told him. Every day. Whatever it was, the formal documentation package, 47 pages, with photographs, architectural analysis, historical context, and the connection to the Aldercott Journal in the Denver collection, was submitted to the State Historical Preservation Office on a Thursday afternoon in late April. Howard called her when it was done. "It's in," he said, and she could hear something in his voice she hadn't heard before. Relief. And beneath the relief, something older and quieter that she recognized as the satisfaction of having done the right thing, not the easy thing. "What happens now?" she said. "State review. They'll assign a reviewer within 2 weeks. From there it goes to the State Board of Review. If they recommend it, and Elena, I think they will. The report is very strong. It goes to the National Register." He paused. "It's not over, but we're on the right road now." "How long until the National Register decision?" "Typically 90 to 120 days from the state recommendation. 3 to 4 months. She sat with that. 3 to 4 months during which Meridian Resource Group would know the clock was running and would know that every day that passed made their options narrower. She didn't sleep particularly well that night either, son. The next move from Gavin Mercer was not another letter and not another visit. She found out about it from Dale Whitfield of all people, which was its own kind of irony. Dale called her on a Friday evening, the first time he'd called her since Marcus's funeral, when he'd left a message saying he was sorry for her loss, and that if she needed anything she shouldn't hesitate, which was the kind of offer people make when they're fairly confident it won't be taken up. "Elena," he said, and his voice had a quality she didn't immediately recognize because she'd never heard it from Dale before. It took her a moment to identify it as discomfort. "I'm calling because I think you ought to know something." "All right," she said. "There was a meeting last night, at the Elks Lodge in Harlan. Someone from a Denver company. Resource development, minerals, I don't know the details. Someone from that company talked to maybe 15, 20 ranchers in the county. Told them the preservation work on your parcel was going to lock up the garrison seam for the whole county. said there was coal under half the valley, and that once your parcel got designated, the whole scene becomes politically untouchable. He stopped. Said the county would lose out on royalty revenue, jobs, that kind of thing. Elena pressed the phone against her ear. Who was there? People. A lot of people. He paused. Including me. And? And I don't know. Some of them were worked up about it, the young guys especially. They're worried about the ranch economics, and the coal money sounds good on paper. He was quiet for a moment. I don't know why I'm telling you this. Because it's the right thing to do, she said. Thank you, Dale. After she hung up, she sat very still at Marcus's table and let herself feel, for about 2 minutes, the full weight of it, the loneliness of it, the particular exhaustion of being one person standing in front of something large that kept finding new angles to come at her from. 2 minutes. She'd learned in the 14 months since Marcus died that you could give yourself 2 minutes and then you had to stop, because there was always something that needed doing, and self-pity was the most expensive luxury she couldn't afford. She called Howard. He's going to the community, she said, and explained what Dale had told her. Howard listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "But that's smart. It's cynical and it's wrong, but it's smart. If he can get enough community opposition to the preservation designation, it complicates the political picture even if the legal case is solid. Can he actually stop the designation? No. The National Register process isn't a popularity contest. But he can make noise. He can slow things down. He can put you in the position of being the person who cost this county coal jobs." He paused. "How do you feel about speaking publicly?" She almost laughed. "I hate it." "I know, but I think we need to get in front of this." He paused. "There's a county commission meeting in 3 weeks. Regular session, public comment period. If we present the historical significance of this site, not just the legal picture but the actual story, James Aldercott, the journal, the cemetery, what this place means for the valley's own history, I think people respond to that differently than they respond to a mineral rights argument." She thought about standing up in the county commission chambers with Dale Whitfield in the room and Travis Whitfield looking amused, and Gavin Mercer somewhere in the background, watching to see what she did. 3 weeks, she said. 3 weeks. Set it up, she said. She spent the next 2 weeks preparing in a way she'd never prepared for anything, which was to say, badly, and then less badly, and then almost competently. She was not a public speaker. She'd never pretended to be. Marcus had been the one who could stand up at a county meeting and hold a room, easy and specific and unhurried, with the natural authority of a man who knew what he was talking about and didn't feel the need to prove it. She was the one who sat next to him and handed him papers and said what she needed to say in private, after. She wrote out what she wanted to say. Then she rewrote it because it sounded like a report. Then she rewrote it a third time because it sounded like an argument, and what she needed wasn't an argument, it needed to be a story. She sat at Marcus's table in the evenings after chores, and she wrote about James Aldercott's journal, which Dr. Summers had arranged for her to read a transcription of, sat for 3 evenings reading a dead man's account of building his life on the hill that was now hers, written in the careful hand of someone who'd taught himself to read and write as an adult, and never quite lost his reverence for the act of writing things down. He'd written about the first winter, the cold, the sound the wind made in the cedar trees on the ridge, the morning he'd completed the chimney and lit the first fire in it, and how his wife Ruth had stood in the doorway watching the smoke rise and said it looked like the hill was breathing. "The hill is breathing," James Aldercott had written. "This is ours now." She read that line sitting alone at the kitchen table at 10:30 at night, and she felt something crack open quietly in her chest. Not grief exactly, more like recognition, the particular resonance of someone else's feeling, fitting exactly the shape of your own. She closed the transcription and sat for a while. Then she opened her notebook and started writing differently. Not preparing remarks, just writing about why it mattered, which was the only honest thing she knew how to do. The county commission meeting was on a Wednesday evening. The chambers held maybe 80 people comfortably, and there were close to 120 by the time the session opened, the overflow standing along the back wall. She hadn't expected that. She'd hoped for a decent turnout and was not prepared for the room to be full. She recognized most of the faces. This was the valley she'd grown up in. These were people she'd known for 30 years, people who'd been at her wedding and at Marcus's funeral, and at the auction where she'd bought 55 acres of poison ivy for $121 while they laughed. They weren't laughing now. They looked serious in the way that people look when money is involved and they're not sure which side of an argument is in their interest. Gavin Mercer was there. She spotted him immediately. Good jacket, third row, a younger man beside him with a laptop. He caught her eye across the room and nodded, a small, neutral acknowledgement, one professional to another. She nodded back. Howard Gass spoke first, presenting the historical case with the methodical precision of a man who'd been building this argument for 20 years and had finally gotten the right example to make it with. He talked about the Aldecott homestead, the journal, the cemetery, the architectural significance of the construction techniques. He was clear and specific and spoke without notes, which Elena had noticed people found more trustworthy than reading from a paper. Then a man she didn't know, introduced as a representative of Millhaven County Landowners United, a group she'd never heard of that had apparently organized in the past 3 weeks, stood up and made the coal argument. Jobs, royalty revenue, the economic stagnation of the county. I was persuasive in the way that economic arguments are always persuasive when people are worried about money, which in this valley, in this year, everybody was. She watched the room shift while he spoke, watched the body language change, people leaning forward, people crossing their arms in different ways, some defensive, some thoughtful, some that looked like agreement. She watched Dale Whitfield, who was sitting 4 rows in front of her, and who she could not read from behind. Then it was her turn. She stood up and she looked at the room, and for a moment her mind went perfectly blank, the way it does before a fence gives way under pressure. That instant of complete suspension before everything moves at once. She said, James Aldecott got here in 1861. He was 40 years old. He'd walked most of the way from Missouri, which I've been thinking about a lot lately because that is an extraordinary thing to do at 40. To walk away from everything you know and go somewhere completely uncertain because you believe something better is possible. The room was quiet. He built a cabin on that hillside by hand. He made the terraces you can see up there now, cut by hand into the slope, because he understood that if you don't hold the soil, it washes away and you lose everything you've built. He raised a family up there. He buried 5 of his children in 1 year. 1 year. And he stayed. She paused. He wrote it all down. His journal is in Denver right now, and scholars have been using it for 40 years to understand what this valley looked like and how people first lived here. But nobody knew where he was. We didn't know where our own history was. She could feel the room listening, not agreeing necessarily, but listening, which was the most she'd hoped for. I bought that hillside for $121 because I needed the spring, she said. I'm going to be honest with you. I needed the water access, and I thought I might be able to make something out of the cleared land. I did not buy it to find a historic site. I did not buy it to prevent coal development. I bought it because I was running out of options, and it was cheap, and I had a feeling about it that I couldn't entirely explain. She looked at Dale Whitfield's back. She wasn't sure why. She looked away. What I found up there changed what I understand about this valley and what I understand about what we owe to the people who were here before us. James Aldecott broke that ground so that this county could exist. He and Ruth and their children, the ones who lived and the ones who didn't, they are the reason there's a Millhaven County to have an economic argument about. She stopped. You can mine coal from somewhere else. You cannot find another James Aldecott. You cannot rebuild what you erase. She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then the sound started. Not applause, not at first, more like the collective exhalation of a room that had been holding its breath. The sound of people settling back into themselves and beginning to talk to the people beside them, which was its own kind of response. Howard was looking at her from across the room. She couldn't quite read his expression. Cautious optimism, maybe. The expression of someone who knew better than to call something won before it was over, but who was allowing themselves a private moment of thinking it might be. She glanced at Gavin Mercer. He was looking at his phone. Whatever she'd said, he'd either already discounted it or was pretending to. She couldn't tell which, and decided it didn't matter. After the public comment period, the commission voted to submit a letter of support to the State Preservation Office for the Aldecott site designation. Not binding, not definitive, but a formal expression of the county's position. The vote was 4-1. She didn't celebrate. She drove home, fed the goats. The full herd, all 36 now, the doe she'd lost in November having never been replaced because she couldn't afford it, and stood in the barn for a while in the lantern light before she went inside. It was a vote. It was a letter. It was not a designation, not yet, and Gavin Mercer was still in the valley with his laptop and his good jacket and his geological assessments that were proprietary, and there were still 3 to 4 months before the National Register decision, and she still owed Consolidated Savings and Loan $4,147, which Carla Briggs had agreed to extend twice and would not extend a third time. She had not solved anything. She had just not lost yet. She went inside and made herself a bowl of soup and sat at Marcus's table in the quiet house, and she was tired in a way that went all the way down to the bone, the kind of tired that isn't solved by sleep, and she sat with it the way you sit with things that can't be fixed quickly, and after a while she got up and washed the bowl and went to bed. The hill was still there in the morning, the way it always was, waiting. The letter from Consolidated Savings and Loan arrived on a Monday in mid-May, and this time it wasn't a default notice. It was a foreclosure filing date. Carla Briggs had been as good as her word, 2 extensions and not a third. The date on the filing was 6 weeks out. Eleanor read it standing at the mailbox in the morning light, the same way she'd read the first one, except this time her hands didn't shake. She'd been expecting it long enough that the actual arrival of it produced something closer to exhaustion than fear. She folded it, put it in her jacket pocket, and went to do the morning chores. She thought about it while she worked. The numbers hadn't changed. She had $4,847. Due to the bank, approximately $900 in her checking account, a herd of 36 goats that were worth maybe $180 a head on a good day, and a cattle operation down to 28 cows that were supporting themselves but generating almost nothing beyond their own feed costs. The parcel on the hillside, the cleared and documented and historically significant parcel that had consumed 9 months of her life, was an asset she couldn't liquidate without destroying everything she'd fought for. Selling it to Meridian would solve the bank problem and end the preservation fight in one stroke. She understood why that option existed. She understood why a reasonable person might take it. She was not always a reasonable person. Marcus had told her that, more than once, with the particular affection of a man who'd found her unreasonableness. One of the things he loved most about her, and also one of the things that occasionally drove him to stand in the barn talking to the horses until he calmed down. She missed him with a sharpness that still caught her off guard, even now, even after all this time. She finished the morning chores and drove to Harlan. She went to the bank first, not because she expected mercy, but because she wanted to look Carla Briggs in the face and say what needed saying before the process moved forward. Carla was in her office, and she looked up when Elena appeared in the doorway with the expression of a woman who'd been doing a difficult job long enough to have made peace with the difficult parts. "Elena," she said. "I know," Elena said. "I'm not here to argue about the timeline." She sat down across the desk. "I need 60 more days." Carla looked at her steadily. "I've given you 60 days twice." "I know that too." Elena put her hands on the desk. Not Marcus's table, not her own wood, someone else's desk, and looked at Carla directly. "The preservation designation on my parcel is moving through the state process. Once it's designated, I have options for historical preservation grants, public-private partnerships, educational access fees. Howard Gast has already had preliminary conversations with 2 university programs about research access agreements." She paused. "I need 60 days for the process to catch up with the reality of what I have." Carla was quiet for a moment. "That's a lot of maybes." "Yes," Elena said. "It is." "The bank board." "I know what the bank board is going to say." Elena kept her voice level. "I'm asking you to make the case for 60 days. Not forgiveness, not a write-down. 60 days and full payment." Carla looked at the file on her desk. She looked at Elena. She had the look of someone doing genuine internal arithmetic, the kind that involves more than numbers. "I'll take it to the board Thursday," she said finally. "I'm not promising." "I know," Elena said. "Thank you." She drove home and didn't let herself think about Thursday until Thursday came, because there was a fence that needed mending on the south pasture, and the goats needed their second rotation moved, and there were approximately 40 other things that needed doing today, and none of them would wait for Thursday. The drought announced itself slowly, the way droughts do, not with a dramatic entrance, but with accumulating absence. April had been dry, May was drier. The creek that ran along the valley floor, which in a normal year ran strong through June and sometimes into July, was already running low by the third week of May, a full month before it usually began to drop. Elena noticed it. She noticed the way the soil cracked along the creek margins, and the way the cattle moved differently when water was getting scarce, restless and irritable, covering more ground. Other ranchers were noticing too. At the feed store in Millhaven, conversations that usually ran to cattle prices and equipment problems had shifted to weather, to creek levels, to the almanac predictions that nobody fully trusted but everybody read. Dale Whitfield had put in a new stock pond 2 years ago and was saying it was the smartest thing he'd ever done, which Elena doubted but didn't argue with. The pasture grass on the valley floor was coming in thin. Not disastrous, not yet, but thin in a way that made experienced ranchers do the feed math in their heads, and not like the answer. On her own operation, Elena was watching the numbers closely. 28 cows needed roughly 25 pounds of dry matter per day each. With the spring grass underperforming by what she estimated was 30%, she was looking at a supplemental feed bill starting in July at the latest, and probably June if the rain didn't come. She had limited cash for supplemental feed, which was not a new problem but was becoming a more urgent one. What she had, which she hadn't fully reckoned with until she walked the cleared hillside on a morning in late May and really looked at it, was the parcel. The reclaimed soil, dark, dense, rested for 60 years under its covering of vines and organic matter, was producing grass with a vigor she hadn't anticipated. Not the thin, struggling growth she'd seen pushing up in December and January, but real grass, deep-rooted and dense, the kind of growth you get from land that has been accumulating fertility for decades without anyone asking anything of it. The terraces that James Aldercott had built into the slope, she now understood, were not just preventing erosion. They were holding water. Every terrace was a small dam, capturing what rainfall came and letting it soak in slowly rather than running off the slope. The spring in the upper section was running full and clear even as Garrison Creek dropped below its banks. She stood on the hillside in the morning light and looked at the grass and thought, this is going to matter. She just didn't know yet how much. The bank board gave her 45 days. Howard called her with the news from the State Preservation Office. On the same afternoon, she got the bank's answer, and for a moment she sat in her truck in the driveway with a phone call open in each hand, figuratively, and thought about the particular absurdity of good news and bad news arriving simultaneously, which was a thing that had happened often enough in her life that she'd stopped finding it surprising. The state review had come back positive. The State Board of Review had recommended the Aldercott Homestead for National Register nomination, which meant the file was now at the federal level, and the final decision would come from the National Park Service's keeper of the National Register. Timeline, she said. 60 to 90 days, Howard said. Potentially faster. I've been told the file is in good shape and the reviewer assigned to it has a reputation for moving efficiently. 60 to 90 days. She had 45 from the bank. There's a gap, she said. I know. He paused. There are bridge options. Emergency preservation loans through the State Historical Fund. They're designed for exactly this kind of situation, where the designation is pending and the landowner needs short-term support. I can have an application in front of them by end of week. Do it, she said. I already started it, he said. She sat in the truck for another minute after hanging up. The mountains to the west were the same color they always were in late afternoon, that deep blue purple that looked painted. She'd looked at those mountains every day of her life, and she still found them, on certain evenings, almost unbearable in their indifference to everything happening below them. 45 days. She'd work with 45 days. The first rancher to call her about feed was a man named Pete Gunderson, who ran about 300 head on the benchland south of Millhaven, and who she knew mostly by reputation. A quiet, self-contained operation, the kind that doesn't make news because nothing goes wrong. He called on a Tuesday in early June. His grass was running out 2 weeks earlier than his calculations. His supplemental feed supplier in Grand Junction had a 6-week backlog. He'd heard from somewhere, he didn't say where, that she had grass on the hillside parcel, and he wanted to know if she'd consider selling some of it as standing forage. She was honest with him. I don't have enough to graze your animals up there, she said. The terrain's not right for cattle, and I can't have outside livestock on the site right now, not with the preservation documentation ongoing. He was quiet for a moment. What about cut and deliver? Even 20, 30 tons of hay equivalent. I've got the equipment to cut if you'll let me in. She thought about it. She hadn't been thinking of it as a hay source, had been thinking of it more as grazing reserve for her own goats, and whatever cattle she might eventually rebuild. But the grass was producing at a rate that was genuinely ahead of what she needed, and 20 tons at current market rates would put real money in her pocket. Not cutting, she said. The site isn't ready for equipment, but I've got goat milk production, and I'm going to start looking at hay options for my own operation. Let me think about what I can actually offer, and I'll call you back. He said that was fair. He thanked her. He didn't laugh. She stood in the kitchen after hanging up and looked at the phone in her hand and thought about the arithmetic of what was happening. The parcel she'd bought for $121 and been laughed at for buying was now, in a drought summer, the most productive piece of land in her immediate area. The soil that had rested under 60 years of vine growth was performing like soil performing doesn't normally perform in this climate, and the spring that had caught her attention in the original survey documents was running when everything else was dropping. She called June Patel. I need to think through what I actually have up there, she said, and what it's worth, and what I can and can't do with it without compromising the preservation work. Can we walk it together? Tomorrow morning, June said without hesitation. 6:30. They walked the hillside for 2 hours. June was thorough in the way of someone who'd been reading land for 40 years, touching soil, pulling grass to check root depth, moving along the terrace edges to see how the water was distributing. She checked the spring output. She counted the producing sections of grass and estimated yields in the practiced shorthand of a woman who'd been doing this arithmetic in her head since before Elena was born. You've got something here, June said at last. They were standing at the upper terrace, the spring audible but not visible through the willows that had grown up around it. This soil is... You don't find this often. The vine mulch has been building carbon in this ground for 60 years. You're sitting on topsoil that most farmers would kill for. What can I do with it that doesn't mess with the historic site designation? June thought about that. Grazing's probably off the table for outside animals. You're right about that. Too much site disturbance risk during the documentation period. She looked across the hillside. But hay production doesn't require heavy equipment if you're selective. You could hand-cut the terrace sections, bale small square, sell to small operations. Labor-intensive but doable. She paused. Or you lease the grazing rights to yourself. Your own goats, extended herd, and you sell the goat milk product rather than the forage directly. You keep control of what happens on the site, and you monetize the productivity. I've been thinking about cheese, Elena said. June looked at her. How long have you been thinking about cheese? A while. She'd been thinking about it since February, actually. Had been reading about small batch artisan cheese production in the evenings. The way she read about things she was seriously considering, methodically, and without telling anyone until she'd thought it through enough to say it out loud. The goat milk production I have now is going straight to a Harlan distributor at commodity prices. I'm leaving money on the table. Artisan product sells for 3 to 5 times commodity. You know how to make cheese? I know how to learn things, Elena said. June looked at her for a moment. Then she did something she didn't often do. She smiled, a real one, the kind that reaches the eyes. You know, when I sold you those first animals, she said, I thought you had a reasonable chance of losing them all by spring. I lost one, Elena said. One, June agreed. Yeah. She looked at the hillside. Sell hay to the people who need it, at fair prices. Not charity, not gouging, fair prices. You're going to need goodwill in this valley more than you need to maximize short-term revenue. Elena nodded. She'd already been thinking that. And start the cheese operation, June said. Small. Don't try to build the whole thing at once. Get your process right with 20 pounds a week before you think about scaling. I know, Elena said. I'm not Marcus. I don't move fast when I don't know what I'm doing. June looked at her. No, she said. You move carefully. That's different. By the end of June, the drought was no longer a concern people mentioned in passing at the feed store. It was the primary fact of life in the valley. The creek had dropped to a thin, unreliable trickle. The benchland pastures had gone brown 3 weeks earlier than anyone could remember. Two operations east of Millhaven had already started hauling cattle to sale rather than watch them lose condition they couldn't restore, taking whatever price the market offered for animals they weren't ready to sell. Dale Whitfield's new stock pond was holding, but his pastures were not. He had 600 head that needed significantly more forage than his land was producing, and his feed suppliers were back-ordered everywhere he'd called. He showed up at Elena's gate on a Thursday morning without calling ahead, which was not something he would have done a year ago. The fact that he did it now told her something about how bad things had gotten on his end. She heard the truck and came out of the barn. He stood by his truck with his hat in his hand, which she also noticed, because Dale Whitfield was not a man who stood with his hat in his hand for anyone. "I need to buy hay," he said, "or access to hay, or whatever you've got up there that you're willing to sell." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the courthouse. She thought about honey. You just bought yourself a pile of itch. She thought about his son Travis's easy amusement and the 4th of July barbecue and what he'd said about women and ranch operations. And she thought about all the ways it would feel satisfying to say, "No. Come back when you've thought about what you said and how you said it, and maybe then we can talk." She thought about that for exactly as long as it deserved. "Come inside," she said. "I'll put coffee on." He sat at Marcus's table, the second person she'd ever made that invitation to in this kitchen, after Gavin Mercer, though this felt completely different. And she put coffee in front of him and sat across, and they talked about what she had and what he needed. She had approximately 40 tons of standing hay equivalent on the upper terraces, by her own estimate in June's. She could supply cut and baled product at a rate that would take most of the summer to deliver, 10 tons at a time, using the small square baler she'd borrowed from Patricia Ogle's nephew. She quoted him a price that was fair and not punishing, current market rate, which was elevated because of regional drought conditions, but not above it. He looked at the number. He nodded. "That's fair," he said. "It is," she said. He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "Elena." He stopped. Started again. "What I said at the auction, and you don't have to," she said. "I know I don't have to." He looked at the table. "I was wrong. Not just about the land, about—" He stopped again, and she could see it cost him something, not because he was a bad man, but because he was a man who'd been right about things most of his life and wasn't practiced at the other thing. "About what you could do, on your own." She looked at him. She wasn't going to make it easy, but she also wasn't going to make it hard. "Hay delivery starts next week," she said. "First 10 tons by Friday." He nodded. He finished his coffee and stood. At the door he turned and said, "How are you managing the bank situation? I heard—" He stopped, apparently aware that he might be stepping somewhere he hadn't been invited. "I'm managing," she said. "Thank you for asking." He left. She stood at the kitchen window and watched his truck go down the drive and thought, Marcus would have liked how that went. Marcus had always believed that people were capable of surprising you if you gave them the room to do it. She wasn't entirely sure he was right about that as a general principle, but today he'd been right. The calls came in steadily through the last week of June and into July. 5 more ranchers, 2 small horse operations, 1 dairy farmer on the North Bench who needed bedding straw as much as forage. She said yes to everyone at the same price, fair market, and she worked from before dawn until after dark, cutting and baling with help she hired from 2 brothers she found through June who worked cheap and fast and didn't complain about the terrain. She deposited the first hay payment, $1,100, Dale Whitfield's first delivery, at Consolidated Savings and Loan on a Friday, not as a payment against the loan, just as a deposit into her operating account. And she watched the teller process it with the specific satisfaction of watching a number move in the right direction. The emergency preservation loan from the State Historical Fund came through in the 3rd week of July. $12,000, short-term, low interest, secured against the pending designation. It cleared the bank default with money left over, which was the first time since Marcus died that she'd had any money left over after anything. She didn't celebrate that either. She moved it immediately into the operating account and started making a list. The cheese operation started on a Saturday morning in late July. In the barn kitchen, she'd spent 3 weeks cleaning and retrofitting with the secondhand equipment she'd sourced from a retired dairy farmer in Pueblo, who was glad to have someone take it who would actually use it. She'd spent 4 weekends in June and July driving to Pueblo and back, taking informal lessons from the farmer's wife, a woman named Dolores, who'd been making cheese for 30 years, and who had the impatient generosity of an expert who enjoys teaching if you're actually paying attention. Elena paid attention. Her first batch was bad. Not inedible, but wrong. The texture was grainy, and the rind developed unevenly, and she threw out 8 pounds of what should have been a soft chèvre. Her second batch was better. Her third was actually right, by her judgment and by Dolores's, whom she called with a photograph and received the comment, "Not bad. The rind's a little thin on the south side. Watch your humidity." She watched her humidity. By August, she was producing 20 pounds a week that she was confident enough in to sell, and she'd had a conversation with the owner of a restaurant in Harlan. A new place, the kind of farm-to-table operation that had started appearing in larger rural towns over the past decade, who'd tasted her chèvre and said he'd take everything she could make at a price that was nearly 4 times what the Harlan distributor was paying for raw milk. She told June about it over the phone. 4 times, June said. 4 times. A pause. How's the scale-up going to work? Slowly, Elena said. I know. Good, June said. Slow is right, for cheese. The hay sales had brought in roughly $8,000 by the end of July, which combined with the preservation loan had given her the first real financial stability she'd felt in nearly 2 years. It wasn't surplus. It wasn't security. It was the feeling of ground under your feet after a long time of feeling like you were standing on something that might give way. She drove up to the parcel on an evening in early August, after the day's work was done, because she sometimes did that. Drove up in the evening just to stand on the hillside and look at what it had become. The grass was high on the terraces. The spring was running. The cabin ruins stood in the angled light with a gravity that she still found moving after all these months, that sense of something old and real pressing through the present. She stood by the cemetery fence and looked at the 7 stones. The valley below was stressed and brown from the drought, but the hillside was green. The goats were visible in the lower paddock, moving steadily, Franklin, pushing the others to where the grass was best, leading with that absolute confidence of an animal that has never once entertained the possibility that his instincts might be wrong. She thought about Gavin Mercer and the geological assessments that were proprietary, and the pending National Register decision that was now somewhere in a federal office being reviewed by someone she'd never met and couldn't contact, and the 45 days the bank had given her that were now almost gone, but which the preservation loan had made moot, at least temporarily, and the hay sales and the cheese and the 36 goats and the 28 cows and the 160 acres and the parcel and the spring and the terraces and the 7 stones and Marcus's table and 2 dead chickens on a Tuesday morning when the envelope arrived and $121 and a paddle raised in a courthouse while the room laughed. All of it was connected, every piece of it. She could see from here how one thing had led to another, and she could also see very clearly that she hadn't known it would when she was living it, had made each decision in the dark, without the overview she had now, purely on instinct and stubbornness, and the occasional advice of people who were smarter than her about specific things. She wasn't going to pretend, even to herself, that it had gone well because she'd planned it well. It had gone as well as it had because she'd kept moving even when she didn't know where she was going, and because she'd been lucky in specific ways at specific moments, and because June Patel had told her about goats, and Patricia Ogle had taken her to the records room, and Howard Gast had called the state office every day, and Dr. Summers had known about the journal. She wasn't the whole story. She'd never been the whole story. But she was still here, and the hill was still hers, and the grass was green in August when the valley below was brown, and tomorrow she had a cheese batch to check, and a hay delivery to organize, and a phone call from Howard. She was expecting about the federal review. She drove home in the last of the light with the windows down, the warm August air moving through the truck, and she thought about James Aldercott writing in his journal, "The hill is breathing. This is ours now." She understood that now, in a way she hadn't when she first read it. It wasn't a statement of possession, it was a statement of commitment. The recognition that belonging to a place and the place belonging to you were the same thing, and that the belonging went both ways, and cost something on both sides, and was worth it, always, even when it was hard, even when the weight of it kept you awake at night. This is ours now. She drove home and went to bed and slept, for the first time in longer than she could remember, without waking in the middle of the night to run numbers in her head. Howard's call came on a Wednesday morning in the second week of August. while Elena was in the barn checking the cheese cultures she'd set the night before. She almost didn't answer. Her hands were in the middle of something precise, the kind of task where interruption costs you, and she'd learned to be protective of the morning hours in the cheese operation because mistakes made before 8 a.m. didn't reveal themselves until 3 days later when you opened a mold and found something wrong. But she saw Howard's name on the screen and she set down what she was holding and picked up. "It's moving faster than we expected," he said. He didn't say hello. He never said hello when he had news. "The federal reviewer contacted me this morning. She's asking for one supplemental item, a chain of title document confirming continuous absence of commercial development since the original Homestead period. It's a formality, Elena. She wouldn't be asking for it if she was going to deny." Elena leaned against the barn wall. "How long to get the document together?" "Patricia's already on it. She called me before I called you." He paused. 2 weeks, maybe 10 days if Patricia works fast, which she will. And then? And then the keeper signs it, and it's done. National Register of Historic Places. Permanent designation. He said the words with a care that told her he'd been waiting a long time to say them. Nobody touches that hillside. Not Meridian, not anyone, not without a federal preservation review that would cost more in time and legal fees than the coal is worth to extract. She didn't say anything for a moment. Outside, she could hear the goats. She could always hear the goats. And somewhere down the valley, a hawk was doing something loud and repetitive that she'd been meaning to investigate for a week. "Howard," she said. "Yeah. Thank you." She said it plainly, without building anything around it, because there was nothing to build. He'd spent 4 months calling people every day, and filing things, and making cases, and driving to county meetings, and believing in the importance of a dead man's cabin on a hillside, when the obvious financial logic said it wasn't worth the effort. He was quiet for a moment. "Don't thank me yet," he said. 10 days. 10 days, she said. She hung up and stood in the barn with the cheese cultures and the sound of the goats, and the feeling of something very large that had been pressing on her chest for a very long time beginning. Not lifting, not yet, but shifting, the way weight shifts when something underneath it starts to move. Gavin Mercer called that same afternoon. She didn't know how he knew. She hadn't told anyone except June, and only in passing. But the timing was not coincidental, and she knew it wasn't coincidental, and she suspected he knew she knew. The preservation process was not private. A federal reviewer asking questions was a signal that anyone tracking the file would read the same way she read it. "Mrs. Harrow," he said. He had a good phone voice, warm, measured, the voice of a man accustomed to making difficult conversations feel reasonable. "I was hoping we could talk before things become final." "They're not final yet," she said. "No," he agreed, "but they're moving in a direction that limits everyone's options." He paused. "I'd like to make one more proposal. In person, if you're willing. There may be a structure that works for both of us, something that addresses your financial situation and still allows Meridian to pursue the resource assessment on the lower portion of the parcel, below the historic site boundary." She almost said no immediately. She thought about it instead, which was not the same thing. The lower portion of the parcel, below the cabin, below the terraces and the cemetery, was a section she'd cleared but hadn't designated as historically significant. Technically, the formal documentation was centered on the upper 2/3. The coal seam, if it ran where the geological logic suggested, might be accessible from the lower section without touching the protected site. She needed to know what he actually knew. She needed to hear him say it. "Tomorrow," she said. "Here, 10 o'clock. He arrived exactly at 10, which told her something about his discipline and also about how much this meeting mattered to him. He was alone this time. No laptop, no young associate. He came to the door instead of waiting by the car, which was different from last time. She noticed the differences the way you notice changes in weather. She put coffee on without asking, and they sat at Marcus's table. He opened his folder and laid out a map, a topographic overlay of her parcel, the historic site boundary drawn in red, the lower section shaded in a different color. He'd had someone prepare this. It was professional and clean, and she looked at it and then looked at him. "The proposal," he said, "is a split arrangement. Meridian purchases the surface and mineral rights to the lower 18 acres, everything below this line." He pointed. "The historic site boundary remains entirely intact. We access the seam from the south edge, which puts all extraction activity well outside the designation area. You retain ownership of the upper 37 acres, including the cabin site and cemetery, plus we fund a conservation easement that permanently protects it." He paused. "And we pay $450,000 for the lower section." She looked at the map. She looked at the red line. She thought about what June had said. The lower terraces aren't part of the original Homestead footprint. The Aldercott activity was all upper slope. And about Howard's assessment that the historic designation covered the cabin, the kitchen garden, the cemetery, and the terraced fields, all of which were upper parcel. $450,000. She picked up the map and looked at it more carefully. The red line was drawn generously, more generously than she might have expected, giving the protected area significant buffer from the proposed extraction boundary. Either Mercer had done his homework on what the designation actually covered, or someone had advised him that offering a tight boundary would be the thing most likely to make her say no. "When did you know about the coal?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "The geological assessment was completed before the auction," he said. She felt the specific cold sensation of having a suspicion confirmed, which is never as satisfying as it should be. "You bid at the auction?" "Yes." "To 110, and then stopped." He was quiet for a moment. "Our assessment indicated the seam access was uncertain from the parcel geometry. The lower section's value was contingent on being able to establish an access route, and at the time we weren't certain." He stopped, and she could see him deciding how honest to be. "At 110 we were testing interest. At the time we didn't anticipate." Another stop. "We underestimated the parcel's other potential complications." "You mean you didn't think anyone would find the cabin?" "Correct," he said. He said it without embarrassment, just as fact. She respected that slightly more than if he'd dressed it up. "So you let me buy it for $121, she said, knowing there was a significant coal deposit underneath it, planning to come back afterward with a purchase offer that you expected I'd take because I needed the money. He didn't answer, which was its own answer. She put the map down. She looked at the table for a moment. Marcus's table, the ponderosa pine he'd sanded smooth, and she thought about what 45,000 tons of coal extracted from her hillside would look like and sound like, and what it would do to the soil and the spring and the watershed below it. And then she thought about $450,000, which was a number large enough to change the shape of the next 10 years of her life. "I need to talk to Howard Gast," she said, "and I need to have a geologist I trust look at where that extraction boundary actually sits relative to the spring drainage." Mercer nodded. He hadn't expected yes today. She could tell. He'd come hoping for interested, and interested was what she was giving him, carefully. "One condition before I consider anything further," she said. "I want Meridian's full geological assessment of this parcel, not a summary, the actual document." He looked at her. "That's proprietary." "I know what you're going to tell me," she said. "And my answer is, if you want me at the table, that document is the cost of entry. You had information I didn't have when I was making decisions about this land. I'm not negotiating blind again." The silence stretched out between them. She could hear the hawk again, somewhere outside, still doing whatever it was doing. "I'll need to get authorization," he said. "You get authorization," she said. "I'll call Howard." He left. She watched the black SUV go down the drive and felt, for the first time in this entire long negotiation, something that was not quite the upper hand but was at least a different kind of footing. She wasn't standing at the edge of a cliff anymore. She was standing at a place where she had something he needed more than he'd anticipated, and where the timeline was shifting in her favor, and where the question was no longer whether she'd survive this, but what kind of deal, if any, she was willing to make. Those were different questions. She wasn't used to them yet, but she was learning. Howard's response to the proposal was characteristically careful. They met at the Historical Society on a Friday morning, sitting at the long table in the research room with the map spread between them and Howard's reading glasses pushed up on his forehead in the way they went when he was thinking hard. "The boundary they've drawn is legitimate," he said. "Everything above this line is within the designation area. The lower 18 acres, technically, it's outside the primary documentation zone." He paused. "That doesn't mean extraction there has no impact on the site. The spring drainage, the soil hydrology. That's a question for someone with more specific expertise than I have." "I'm getting a hydrologist out," she said. "June knows someone at the state water office." "Good." He looked at the map. "Elena, I want to be honest with you about something. Go ahead. $450,000 is real money, and the conservation easement they're proposing for the upper parcel, if it's structured correctly, could actually strengthen the site's long-term protection more than the designation alone does. Designation prevents federal undertakings from harming the site. A properly written conservation easement prevents private development in perpetuity. He took his glasses off entirely. I'm not telling you to take the deal, but I'm not telling you it's wrong either. She looked at him. You thought I'd fight this all the way. I thought you might, he said. I also think you're smarter than fighting something all the way when there's a version of winning that doesn't require it. She sat with that for a moment. What does the Aldercott site actually need, she said, to be what it should be? What does it need that it doesn't have right now? Howard leaned back. Structural stabilization of the cabin walls? That's immediate, before another winter. Proper archaeological survey of the full site. There may be significant material culture below the surface that hasn't been located yet. Interpretive signage. Controlled public access. A trail, a small parking area on the county road. Long-term, a visitor shelter. He paused. We've had preliminary interest from 3 universities about research partnerships. To host that properly, you'd need basic infrastructure, running water access for researchers, which your spring could support with minimal development. What does all of that cost? He named a figure. It was less than $450,000, but not by as much as she'd expected. She looked at the map. She looked at the red line. She looked at the lower 18 acres where James Aldercott had never built anything, where the original surveyor's notes didn't mention any structure or cultivation, where the garrison coal seam apparently ran through rock that had never been part of anyone's life except geologically. She thought about what she actually believed, which was harder than thinking about what she wanted to believe. She believed the cabin mattered. She believed the cemetery mattered. She believed the terraces and the kitchen garden and the spring and the story of James Aldercott were worth protecting, permanently and seriously, not just legally, but physically, with the resources that real protection required. She was not sure she believed that the lower 18 acres, the unimproved, undeveloped, historically inert lower slope, was worth fighting for as a matter of principle when the fight would cost her the resources to protect the thing that actually mattered. That was an uncomfortable thing to believe. She sat with the discomfort of it, because that was the only honest way to sit with it. I'm not saying yes, she told Howard. I'm saying I need the hydrologist's report and the full geological document from Meridian, and then we'll see what we actually have. He nodded. That's the right answer, he said. Oh, the hydrologist's name was Sandra Reyes, and she came out on a Tuesday in late August with equipment that Elena didn't recognize and a thoroughness that immediately inspired confidence. She spent 6 hours on the hillside. She ran water table tests, tracked the spring's drainage path, modeled the subsurface flow. She talked to herself while she worked, a running low-volume commentary that Elena caught fragments of but didn't try to follow. At the end of 6 hours, Sandra sat down on a terrace wall with a bottle of water and her notebook and said, The spring is fed from a fracture system in the upper granite. The drainage flows northwest, away from the proposed extraction zone, not through it. If they work the lower section, the risk to your spring from hydrological disruption is low, not zero. Low. Elena absorbed that. Define low. Less than 10% probability of meaningful impact based on current data, assuming they use standard modern extraction protocols and honor the boundary. Sandra looked at her notes. If they don't honor the boundary, all bets are off. But the geology separates cleanly at the line they've drawn. Someone knew what they were doing when they drew it. Or they knew what they were protecting, Elena said. Same thing, in this case. She thought about Gavin Mercer. She thought about his prepared map, the generous red line, the fact that someone at Meridian had been careful. She didn't know if the care was ethical or just strategic, if they'd drawn the line where they'd drawn it because they respected the site, or because they understood that damaging a National Register property would bring down a level of federal attention that would cost them far more than the coal was worth. She wasn't sure in the end that the distinction changed the practical calculation. She called him that evening. I want the conservation easement language reviewed by our own attorney before I sign anything, she said. I want extraction noise and dust mitigation requirements written into the agreement. I want a remediation bond that covers full site restoration if they exceed the boundary. And I want the funding for the Aldercott site preservation work, Structural stabilization, archaeological survey, interpretive infrastructure, paid in advance, not as a future commitment. Silence on the line. She could hear him thinking, or the equivalent of it, the particular quality of silence that is really just fast arithmetic. The advance funding for site preservation, he said. What amount? She named a figure. It was Howard's number, rounded up by 15% for contingency, because she'd learned enough about projects on old buildings to know that contingency was not optional. That's manageable, Mercer said, and she could hear in the way he said it that it was, in fact, manageable, and that she probably could have asked for more, and that she was filing that information away for the next time she sat across a table from someone like him. Get me the full geological assessment by Friday, she said. Your attorney can call Howard Gast about the easement language. We'll talk again next week. She hung up and sat at the table and looked at her hands. She hadn't planned any of this. She'd bought 55 acres of poison ivy because she needed a spring and had 121, and she'd sent goats up a hillside because June Patel had mentioned it while sorting kids, and she'd walked into a roofless cabin because she'd followed a chimney through the brush, and she'd called Howard Gast because Patricia Ogle suggested it, and she'd spoken at a county meeting because she didn't know what else to do. And somehow the accumulation of those imperfect, half-blind decisions had landed her here, sitting at Marcus's table in the house that was not going to be foreclosed on, holding a negotiation with a Denver corporation that needed something from her. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt tired and cautious, and aware that the deal wasn't done and that things could still go sideways, and also aware, quietly, without fanfare, that she was going to be all right, that the ranch was going to be all right. That was enough for tonight. The National Register designation came through on a Thursday in the first week of September. Howard called her at 7:15 in the morning before she'd finished her first cup of coffee, and she could hear in his voice the specific quality of someone who had been waiting for this news and who was not going to pretend to be calm about it. The keeper signed it, he said. As of this morning, the Aldercott Homestead is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. She put the coffee cup down. Elena? I'm here, she said. It's permanent. Federal protection. They can challenge it, Meridian or anyone else. But the legal standard for delisting is effectively impossible to meet for a site with this level of documentation. I know, she said. We did it. She almost corrected him. You did a lot of it, but stopped, because she understood that he meant it collectively, that he was including her and Patricia and Dr. Summers and Sandra Reyes and June and everyone who'd been part of this accumulation that looked, from the outside, like a plan, but had been, from the inside, mostly just not giving up. We did it, she said. She went up to the hillside that morning before any other work, which was something she almost never did. Mornings were for chores and there was always something urgent. But today she went up. She stood at the cemetery fence and looked at the 7 stones in the September morning light. Something about the light in September in this part of Colorado is specific to itself. It has a quality of clarity and angle that summer light doesn't have, as if the air has been cleaned by something. It made the stones look precise and real and old in a way that moved through her chest. National Register, she said to James Aldercott's stone. Federal protection. You're not going anywhere. She stood there for a while. The valley below was still brown from the drought, but there were clouds building to the southwest, the first real cloud formation in 6 weeks, and the air had that particular charged quality that sometimes preceded rain. The goats were in the lower paddock, moving steadily, Franklin conducting his usual campaign to be in 3 places at once. She drove back down the hill and got to work. The deal with Meridian closed in October. It took 6 weeks of back and forth on the easement language, 2 redrafts of the remediation bond, 1 dispute about the definition of the extraction boundary that required a surveyor to be physically present on the hillside with both attorneys watching, and 1 moment in a conference room in Harlan when Gavin Mercer said something about the site preservation funding being reclassified as a loan rather than a grant, and she stood up from the table and put on her jacket and said, "Call me when that changes," and walked out. He called 3 hours later. It changed. She signed the final documents on a Thursday afternoon in a lawyer's office that smelled of carpet cleaner and old coffee. The preservation funding, in full in advance, was transferred to a joint account controlled by the Millhaven County Historical Society and Elena Harrow. The conservation easement was recorded with the county clerk. The purchase price for the lower 18 acres, $450,000, minus the attorney fees that she had not fully anticipated and that she was going to think about for a long time, landed in her account 2 business days later. She paid off consolidated savings and loan on a Monday morning. She walked into the bank, sat down across from Carla Briggs, and put a cashier's check on the desk. Carla looked at the check. She looked at Elena. In full, she said. In full, Elena said. Carla processed the payment with the efficient precision she brought to everything and printed the paid-in-full confirmation and slid it across the desk. She looked like she wanted to say something and wasn't sure if it was appropriate in the context of her professional role. Then she said it anyway. I'm glad it worked out. Me too, Elena said. She drove home and put the paid-in-full confirmation in the desk drawer next to the first foreclosure notice. Not for any particular reason, just because it seemed like the 2 documents belonged together. The structural stabilization of the cabin began in November, carried out by a historic preservation contractor from Pueblo, who'd worked on 3 other National Register sites in the region, and who walked the site on the first day with the focused appreciation of someone seeing something they recognized as rare. He told her the original stonework was in better condition than he'd expected. Dry conditions under the vine cover had actually protected it, and that with proper stabilization, the walls could stand for another 100 years without significant intervention. She stood and watched him work for a while, which she knew was not a useful thing to do, but she did it anyway. The archaeological survey ran through November and into December. The team, 3 graduate students and their supervising professor from the state university, found, beneath the floor of the cabin, a collection of objects that had been sealed under the collapsed loft since approximately 1979. An iron pot, several hand-forged tools, a leather-bound book that was not the journal but was some kind of account ledger in Ruth Aldercott's hand, and a child's boot, single, small, hand-stitched, that nobody talked about much when they found it, but that affected everyone present in the specific way that small objects belonging to dead children always do. The ledger went to conservation. When the conservator's preliminary report came back in January, it noted that the ledger contained Ruth Aldercott's records of the valley's first community gatherings, names of families, dates, what was brought, and what was shared. A social record of the valley's first winter community, 1864 to 1865, in the handwriting of the woman who'd organized it. Howard Gast called Elena when he got the report. His voice had a quality she'd never heard from him before. Something that in a less restrained man would have been called excitement, but in Howard was more like sustained amazement. Ruth Aldercott kept the records, he said. She was the one who organized the winter gatherings. James gets the credit in the secondary literature because the journal is his, but the community records are hers. Elena thought about the stone. Ruth Mary Aldercott. She made it home. She thought about what it meant to make a home somewhere, not just to build a structure, but to build the web of relationships and shared history and remembered meals. That is what home actually means. Ruth had done that. Ruth had organized the gatherings and kept the ledger and made it home while James wrote about the chimney smoke. Make sure her name is on the interpretive signage, Elena said. Already planned, Howard said. What? The first visitors came in the spring. Not many. The site wasn't formally open yet. The trail wasn't completed and the signage was still being fabricated. But word had gotten out through the academic community and through the County Historical Society newsletter, and people started showing up at the gate and asking politely if they could walk up to see it. She said yes, mostly, as long as they stayed on the marked paths and didn't touch the structures. She found she didn't mind the visitors the way she'd expected to. There was something she found unexpectedly moving about watching strangers stand in the cemetery and read the stones and go quiet. A woman came one Saturday in April. She was maybe 70, driving a car with Missouri plates, and she stood at James Aldercott's stone for a long time without saying anything. When Elena walked over to check on her, the woman said, without turning around, "My grandmother always said we had people who went west and didn't come back east. She could never find out where they went." "The name Aldercott?" Elena said. "No," the woman said, "but neighbors, same county in Missouri." She was quiet for a moment. "It's something, isn't it? To find where someone ended up." "Yes," Elena said. "It is." She thought about that for a long time afterward. By summer, 14 months after the first goat had set foot on the hillside and 32 months after Marcus died. The shape of Elena's life had become something she wouldn't have recognized if you'd shown it to her from the outside on the day she'd stood in the courthouse with her paddle raised and the room laughing. The cattle herd was back to 56 animals. Not 91, not yet, but solid and healthy and running on pasture that the drought had tested and that it held. The cheese operation was producing 60 pounds a week and had a waiting list from 3 restaurants in Harlan and 1 in Pueblo who tasted it at a regional food event and called her directly. She'd hired a part-time assistant, a young woman named Cass, who showed up on time and learned fast and had the useful quality of asking good questions and then listening to the answers. The goats numbered 48. Franklin was still alive, still impossible, still finding fence gaps that shouldn't exist. She'd stopped being annoyed about it entirely and had moved into a kind of philosophical acceptance that she suspected said something about how she'd changed. She walked the full parcel on a morning in late June, the whole 55.4 acres, which she could now walk from boundary to boundary without fighting through a single foot of overgrowth, the transformation so complete that it was hard to remember the wall of green that had stood here 2 years ago. The trail was finished, winding from the parking area up through the lower section, across the terraces, past the stabilized cabin walls, and ending at the cemetery. The signage was in place, solid oak panels with engraved text that Patricia Ogle had spent 3 weeks getting exactly right. The first panel, at the trailhead, read, Aldercott Homestead, established 1861. This site preserves the earliest documented permanent settlement in the upper Garrison Creek Valley. James and Ruth Aldercott, built here in the year Colorado, was not yet a state, and their lives, and the community they helped build, are the foundation on which this valley stands. She stopped and read it, even though she'd read it a dozen times. There was something about seeing it on permanent oak signage that made it feel different from reading it on paper. More settled, more real. She walked on up to the cemetery. The fence had been repaired and stabilized by the preservation contractor, the iron rod cleaned and treated, the wire replaced where it had deteriorated past saving. The stones were the same stones. She'd refused the suggestion that they be professionally cleaned or reset because the wear on them was part of what they were. But the ground around them was tended now, the grass kept short, the interior of the enclosure clear. She stood at James Aldercott's stone. She thought about the day she'd first stood here, in the cold, with the goats working above her and the valley still laughing at her judgment. She thought about what she'd understood then and what she understood now, and the difference between the two, which was not as large as it should be, maybe. She was still impulsive, still stubborn, still bad at asking for help until the last possible moment, still prone to sitting alone at kitchen tables when she should probably be calling someone. She hadn't become a different person. She'd just become a more certain version of the same one. She thought about Marcus. She thought about him the way she'd learned to think about him, not with the sharp grief of the early months, but with something more like the feeling you get from an old scar, present and permanent and not painful unless you press directly on it, and even then the pain has changed from what it was. She missed him. She would probably always miss him, and that was not a problem to be solved. She crouched down and pulled a clump of grass that was pushing under the base of James's stone, which was not the kind of thing a person does at a National Register historic site, probably, but it was the kind of thing she was going to do anyway because she'd been tending this specific piece of ground for 2 years, and old habits don't reclassify themselves just because a federal agency has weighed in. Ruth's in the ledger, she told the stone. She got credited properly. Howard made sure of it. She stood up. The valley spread below her in the June morning light, the creek, running again since the autumn rains had broken the drought, visible as a line of cottonwood green along its course. The benchland pastures were recovering. The ranches that had sold cattle in the worst of the drought were rebuilding. The Elks Lodge meeting that Gavin Mercer had organized seemed, from this distance, like something that had happened in another season entirely, which it had. She could see her own land from here, the 412 acres that had been 412, then less again, and was now 160 plus the 37 acres of the historic parcel, plus the lower 18 that she'd sold, but that still sat adjacent to her boundary, not yet disturbed, Meridian's permits still working through state review. She had opinions about how that was going to go, and had expressed those opinions through the appropriate channels, and had been told, politely, that the process would proceed according to the process. She'd said, equally politely, that she'd be watching. Below her, on the lower trail, she could hear voices. Visitors, early ones, coming up from the parking area. She could make out 2 adults and at least 1 child, the child's voice higher and faster than the adults, asking questions she couldn't hear the words of from this distance. Only the rhythm. The persistent, hopeful, slightly impatient rhythm of a child who wants to understand things. She watched them come up the trail. The child was maybe 8, a girl, wearing a bright yellow jacket that caught the morning light. She was running slightly ahead of the adults, the way children do when they're interested in something, and she stopped at the first interpretive sign and read it with the exaggerated concentration of a child who has recently become proud of her reading. Elena watched her read. She thought about what it meant, not abstractly, not as a principle, but specifically in her body. That a child was reading Ruth Aldercott's name on a sign on a hillside that had been invisible for 60 years. She thought about the 60 years of vine growth that had sealed all of this away, and the 121 and the goats, and Franklin finding fence gaps, and Patricia in the records room, and Howard calling every day, and Dr. Summers and her recorder muttering numbers into it, and June sorting kids in the morning light, and Dale Whitfield standing at her gate with his hat in his hand, and Carla Briggs sliding a paid-in full confirmation across a desk, and Marcus's table, and the first foreclosure notice, and the ponderosa pine sanded smooth by years of use. None of it had been inevitable, any single piece of it going differently, and none of the rest would have followed. She'd walked the edge of losing everything so many times in the past 2 years that looking back at it felt like looking down from a height, dizzying and clarifying at the same time. The girl in the yellow jacket finished reading the sign. She turned around and called to the adults behind her. Elena still couldn't hear the words, only the tone, which was the unmistakable tone of a child who has found something out and wants to tell someone about it immediately. The adults caught up. They stood together at the sign, all 3 of them, and the girl pointed at something on the panel and talked, and the adults nodded and asked questions back. Elena turned away and gave them their moment with it, because it wasn't hers anymore exactly. It was hers to steward, which was a different thing, a thing that required you to hold on firmly and let go at the same time. She walked back down the trail toward the parking area. She had morning chores, she had a cheese batch to check, she had a meeting with Howard in the afternoon about the summer programming calendar and a call with Cass about the milk production numbers, and a fence on the north pasture she'd been meaning to get to for 2 weeks. The hawk was back, or maybe a different hawk, she could never tell, doing its loud, repetitive thing over the lower paddock. Franklin was audible from the far paddock, which meant he'd found something that required commentary. She got in the truck and drove down the hill toward her ranch, her land, her imperfect and continuing life, in the ordinary morning light of an ordinary June day in a valley that was, because of what had been found and what had been kept, no longer quite ordinary at all.